Talk. This is part of our ongoing special coverage of the 2019 midterm elections. Joining us is Professor Ronald Holmes of the De La Salle University. He's also the president of PULS Asia. We're very glad to have Ronald Holmes with us to explain the surprises, to answer difficult questions. Welcome to Rappler Talk, Ronnie.
Thank you, Martes.
Thanks for giving us the time. First, are you surprised or are you not surprised by I'm talking about the Senate race. Did you have any surprises?
Not really that surprised. Maybe the movement in terms of ranks is something that should be expected. We've had, even in the past, normally in our surveys, we say that these are the people in contention. The top 3, 4 positions are more or less set. They switch among each other. And then anywhere from 5th to 16th or 17th, that's where you do have a bigger swing in terms of ranks. But the ones in contention now are essentially the ones that we caught in the survey also, the last survey that we conducted May 3 to 6. So there's not much of a surprise, at least for us.
How about Francis Tolentino? In your last survey, he was anywhere from 10 to 15. Now he's number 9.
Yeah, but if I recall, in the March survey, February and March survey, Francis Tolentino was also in those ranks. So that means his voting support fluctuated in April and May, and he may have recovered. The other thing that we should take note is that our surveys do not capture what is referred to as command votes. These are the votes that basically national candidates can try to generate by working with local politicians or alliances with subnational politicians. In exchange for that, they would basically promise maybe some benefits on the part of, let's say, budgetary allocations in the future. But those are command votes. Those are not captured by surveys.
But command votes are not unique to Francis Tolentino.
They're not unique to Francis Tolentino. They're not unique to any candidate.
Yes.
This will be in areas where particular candidates would be strong, where they may have actually established longer alliances, and there's a tendency, therefore, for those alliances to mobilize support for candidates. And of course, it's pretty hard to estimate the extent of the proportion of command votes relative to market votes that candidates will get. I think that can be done, but we will have to get the full results, disaggregated by province down to the cities, to see whether a candidate got more. But normally candidates have what are referred to as core voters in the places that they came from. In the case of Francis, I would expect that the Tagaytay City voters will basically go out and support him more because that's the family's bailiwick.
But were you surprised by the zero performance of the opposition? No one so far is in the top 12.
Well, it was not something that you would want. No, it's not something that because as a political scientist, one of the ideals of supposed democratic order is that you have a check and balance system, that you would have some form of a group that would fiscalize within an institution. In the upper house, for example, then you would have an opposition, a minority that is larger than we've had over the past 3 years. And normally, the minority in Congress would really be small. It's not distinct to Duterte, but nonetheless, the minority should at least be as it was. There were 6 members of the minority in the last Congress. There will be 4 in the next Congress because the 2 in so-called oppositionists, the 2 who belong to a camp that is not allied with Duterte, the Ocho de Lezo camp, are now not in contention. No? These are re-electionist Senator Bam Aquino and former Secretary Mar Rojas. It is not surprising because in the last surveys, there were also, only Bam was in contention but tied in the lower ranks, and Mar was already out of contention in our surveys since April.
I'm surprised by Mar Rojas because in your early surveys, he was doing number 9.
Yeah.
He was doing within the 12. And then he started to drop until your latest survey. What do you think accounts for this?
It's quite surprising also because in the first place, if we take the reports coming from the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, Mar had spent the most in terms of advertisements. Part of the explanation might be the extent by which advertisements really appealed or connected with the voters. Of course, that's very hard for us to establish. The second one would be essentially how his reputation has been affected by all of the criticisms against the previous administration coming from this administration, which basically started from day one. Um, and he has not been in any position. Actually, I think former Secretary Rojas only came back to the limelight quite recently.
Yeah, when he declared
when he
his-
declared, and
his
that was the time that he
candidacy.
had more of the infomercials. There were no infomercials before. And for a while, I was told that he was out of the country also. No? But that's not essential. More important thing is that the previous administration has always been criticized by the incumbent administration, and that might have taken its toll insofar as the voting support of Secretary Rojas.
And in the case of Bam Aquino, he's one of two re-electionist senators who did not make it so far, J.V. Ejercito and Bam. Usually, incumbents have a bigger chance of returning to the Senate, right?
Yeah, they normally have a bigger chance, although we've seen incumbents in the past who have lost. Re-election is for that matter. In the last election, for example, if I can recall, T.J. Gongona and Sergius Mena not
Yes,
making it.
yeah.
Because you're competing with also people who've been with the institution and people who are running for re-election who may be a bit more prominent, may actually be top-of-mind choices on the part of the voters. So you're competing with a lot that has essentially the same level of awareness. In addition to that, of course, in the case of Senator Bam Aquino, it's the same, the impact of the critical stance and the criticism and the bashing, as they put it, of the current administration towards members of the Liberal Party. So that would have also had an impact on his
So is this 2019 midterm elections an affirmation of Senator Duterte? I'm sorry, I demoted him. Of President Duterte as a leader, his extrajudicial killings, his drug war policy, everything that he has done in the first 2 years.
I wouldn't say it's an affirmation or it's a vote of confidence for all of the things that the administration has done. Definitely, in our surveys, we still see a significant support for the campaign against illegal drugs, for the drug war. Although in previous surveys, we also saw apprehension with regard to being a victim of extrajudicial killings. But that's just one of the things. No? The more important things that we've seen across from survey to survey would be that the most urgent concerns on the part of the public are largely material and gut concerns. Inflation, pay, jobs, and the reduction of poverty. And if you go in that context, in the economic context, we have not really seen that much of an erosion in terms of economic growth. We saw an escalation of inflation third quarter of last year,
yes.
but then it was all immediately addressed by coming up with certain measures, for example, in terms of tarification, the relaxation of tariffs on rice. So there are things that they've been able to address to the extent that, the stomach, the gut is not really that much affected. And in that sense, although credit cannot be claimed completely by this administration because this economic growth of averaging 6% has gone on since 2011. And even in the prior administration, it was also consistent growth, except in the global financial crisis of 2007.
But this still affirms his popularity as president. And in fact, the
Yeah.
three candidates he endorsed are all so far in the 12.
Well, his popularity, his approval rating, and his trust rating remain high. But it's comparable to the trust rating of former President Aquino.
Yes, I was going to ask you how different. Aquino was the first president to enjoy 4 years
Yeah.
of high popularity.
More or less sustained until
Yes.
Mamasapano.
Correct.
So that's more than 4 years.
Yes.
And it declined only, in the case of former President Aquino, in January 2013. In November 2012, I checked the data earlier, his approval rating was 80%.
Wow.
And then it declined by, I think, 12 points. It went down to 68 January 2013. But that was really because of electioneering. Everyone's approval rating declined. And we see the same thing in the case of the current president. But the current president started off with a higher approval and trust rating, President Duterte. But he has been able to sustain it. But the length of time that we will sustain it has not matched the way that the former president sustained his approval rating. To us, I mean, what does that tell us?
Yes.
Essentially, that the expectation of the public would be that, presidents can at least somehow fulfill their main promises. They did not completely fulfill it, right? But for example, in the case of former President Aquino, it's a question of not being corrupt. There were no personal integrity issues against former President Aquino. And then he went after the big fish. At least there were two that he caught within the first 3 years of his term.
That's the impeachment,
Impeachment
of the Chief Justice.
Ombudsman, and then the impeachment
Okay.
and the conviction of Chief Justice Corona.
Yes.
So in that regard, those are indicators of him fulfilling a promise about weeding out corruption. In the case of President Duterte, although he admits that he has not succeeded, the campaign against illegal drugs continue. It's controversial, it has caused so many deaths, but it has also somehow assured probably the ones who are supporting him that their personal safety are more or less more certain under this administration, except that they're worried that they might be also victimized.
So President Duterte, if he continues his popularity rating, he will duplicate Aquino's record. But you said he already dipped but went up
Yeah,
again.
he dipped and then went up again.
Yeah.
And I think in the case of former President Noynoy Aquino, the dip was significant from November to January, November 2012 to January 2013. And then it was more or less stable. It was dipping marginally. And the most significant reduction happened again in 2015, Mama Sapano.
Yeah, okay.
That was January 2015. And then he recovered also, to the extent that it was majority approval again in the next quarterly survey.
So this is not, I just want to be clear, this is not unique to President Duterte. Because
Not-
people are saying, oh, how spectacular, he's such a popular president.
Not unique, and even if you go by the data of the other survey institutions, such as the social weather
Yes.
stations, it's not unique. The only distinct thing, I think, would be the continuous decline in terms of the approval satisfaction ratings of another president, that's Gloria Macapagal Arroyo after 2005.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Even as House Speaker,
Even as House
House
Speaker,
Speaker, she
she's
remains
getting
unpopular, right?
higher disapproval than approval and higher distrust compared to trust.
so Ronnie, can we go over Cynthia Villar? Can we look at Cynthia Villar? Number one, for the longest time during your survey periods, it was Grace Po, and then she was taken over. What led to her, reaching these heights?
I would think that it's primarily the campaign strategy of really, I think her advertisements, her advertising spending across platforms is second to Mar. And then she's hitting on an issue that involves basically livelihood. In the past, when the first time she campaigned, she was talking of herself as Mrs. Hanap Buhay, right? So in that sense, she has placed herself as someone who would take care of who would spark entrepreneurship on the part of the public, who can actually motivate people in terms of engaging in livelihood. So, plus, of course, the campaign spending, as I said, it's massive. I would think that the posters, the radio advertisements, the print, and the television advertisements would be more than any other candidate. In that report, if I'm not mistaken, she's second to Mar, and the third one is Bongo. Grace Po was way behind, I think, about 9th or 10th position in terms of ad spend.
And perhaps their businesses all over the country, the Villar's Camellia
Yeah, and then,
subdivisions, they're in most parts of the Philippines.
And then you had the convenience stores, which would have the posters. So, because those are the things, it's like people somehow try to underrate the posters, but posters have a important role, especially closer to the election. If you're going to a prison and the poster is there, then you remember it. But you saturate the place with so much posters, then it sticks to the mind of the voters. And she's been in the institution also, so you expect her and Grace and someone who's returning like Pia Cayetano.
Yes, I was surprised, by Pia Cayetano because she was away from the Senate, but she was in Congress. She was away nationally for 3 years, yet she's done well in her
Yes,
comeback.
she's done well. Again, it's and the women in our initial surveys, up to these surveys, were the ones who were doing better. Of course, joining them in the past was another re-election is Nancy Binay, who was slid somehow no, in the partial unofficial count that we're getting right now.
So you're not surprised by Nancy's being number 12?
Her preferences were fluctuating. She was going up and then going down. Her rank in the last survey was tied up to the 15th. So it's not something surprising because if you apply the margin of error, the proportion of
Yes.
voting support may actually go down to the point that she will slide to a lower rank.
But it was Bong Revilla who was anywhere from 4 to 8 and then is now so far number
somehow in number
11
10.
or
Number 10. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's I don't know exactly. We don't have the numbers yet in terms of actual voting turnout and what proportion of the votes to the Senate they got. But I'm sure that the votes of Senator Revilla will be less than the votes that he got when he topped the senatorial elections in 2010. At that time, I think he had more than 50% of the votes of cast for Senate.
This number of women who made it to the Senate, no? Does it say anything about a preference for women, or it just so happens that...
It just so happens. I don't think, as I've expressed many times in the past, I don't think that there's an electorate, a women's electorate, a women's vote in the country. I think the women's movement would really have to work on creating that vote. Although we've had legislators who work on issues that promote women's rights, like reproductive health law,
Yes.
and then most recently the extension of the maternity leave.
Okay.
But when it comes to, let's say, some issues like divorce, even candidates coming from Ocho Derecho were against divorce. So you have that difficulty in terms of getting. So they're there because they've been with the institution. They're known quantities. The names are popular. They've done well, I mean, creditably as senators. They might not be as independent as you would want them to be, but they're not exactly malperforming. And they've not been charged of any, let's say, even alleged to be engaged in corrupt practices.
Are you ready to say that the dynasty of the Estradas is dead? I mean, in the Senate, the two brothers or half-brothers are not in the top 12. And of course, in the local, in Manila, they lost it. San Juan also was...
Well, for now, I think at the local, then they would have to sit it out for 3 years. What's good for politicians in the Philippines is that the electoral cycle is short. It's 3 years.
They can come back.
Political science will find it too short, actually. But that's good for politicians because they can come back. And then the performance of the ones who will replace them will determine their fate also. But on the national level, it's still, there are about, I think, 6% more of the precincts that have yet to report. And the one closest to 12th position is JV.
It's JV Ejercito.
Who is trailing Nancy Binay by about more than 200,000 votes. So
that's still iffy.
Yeah, and normally that's the range, that's the difference between candidates who are fighting it out for the last position. So we'll know, but if it so happens, then it at least temporarily holds the political careers of members of the family.
But also only to be replaced by new families.
Yeah, for example, in the case of San Juan, then you have Zamora, and then, of course, in Manila, you have someone who's been in the establishment in the past, who's also close to the administration, having served as Undersecretary of the Department of Social Welfare. So,
is this
Isko Moreno.
I didn't know, sorry. I didn't know he was Undersecretary.
I'm not mistaken, he was Undersecretary of Social Welfare for a moment. But so you don't know exactly whether, because it's his first term. And his abilities as mayor will be tested.
Of course, men are talking about the zero, absence of any opposition winner in the Senate. And I was I think I messaged you earlier. Can this be compared to 1938 when Quezon, it was a unicameral assembly though,
Yeah.
and there was no opposition voted in. Can we compare it, or is it like apples and oranges?
It's more like apples and oranges because if you remember, Quezon really was the most dominant personality in Philippine politics during the Commonwealth and even part of the Commonwealth to the extent that Quezon defined, influenced greatly the framing of the Philippine Constitution. So that's the difference there. Duterte might have most of the powers of the president, but to me, as a political observer, he has not been as attentive to Congress as other presidents have been. He has
You mean
left Congress
okay, yeah.
to its own devices, to the extent that, most recently you had two houses of Congress fighting it out in terms of what insertions one put in. Eventually, the president favoring the position of the Senate and vetoing the insertions coming from the lower house. So he has become an arbiter in terms of this constant difference between the two houses of Congress, only recently. So I don't know whether the president will be more attentive to Congress and whether he'll be pushing an agenda in the second half of his term. Because in the second half of the term, many of our politicians who are aspiring for higher positions will be much more focused in terms of preparing for those vying for those positions.
We've always been saying that Duterte controls Congress, yet, as you said, during the budget feud, even two factions in the House of Representatives, even they were feuding. So he did not step in
He did
to
not step
mediate.
in. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have any control of Congress. President has had a supermajority of both houses of Congress in the last 3 years. The opposition in the Senate might be reduced to 4 from 6. That's the only difference that would
But
happen.
the fourth cannot vote. That's like, I mean, are
Yeah,
we
but
talking of the Senate?
she can still express her
Yes.
sentiment.
Okay.
And then eventually, I think, I don't know what the rules of the Senate are, but the rules of the Senate might allow for recording of the vote of a member of the Senate on certain issues. But then again, it's not really as large a minority to begin with. Then the other members of the Senate have taken positions that are not necessarily close to what the president's position are, at least the more senior members of the Senate. And you would expect more of them to take independent positions, especially on issues where they feel that the public opinion would not be supportive of, where they feel that the public would not really support. Because they're all politicians anyway. There's a certain degree of pragmatism that you should expect, especially for the ones who will be running for the election or aspiring for a higher position.
So, while the allies of Duterte dominate will dominate the next Senate, it still have a chance of being independent because of the political ambitions.
I think there's still a chance that it will be independent on key issues. For example, on charter change, I don't know whether that boat will continue to sail.
It's either federalism or a shift to parliamentary system.
Yeah. If it's federalism and then you maintain the presidential system, then it may sail. But it depends also on what the thing there is that the changes, politicians cannot be ascertain what those changes would be. The sitting ones, at least, they will not be fully in control of that process of change. So, if I were a politician, the first thing that would come to mind is that how can I stop or prevent this from happening? Because I don't want to make that choice later on. So what I'll do is that I'll gather support from other people who are worried about such a proposal. And it's easier to prevent it than get into the process and eventually lose control of the entire thing, where dominant forces may suddenly talk about taking out the Senate, right? Or creating just a Senate that is more regional rather than something that is national. Those are things that hit on the interests of people who are sitting as senators. So there are things that are uncertain that I think many members of the upper chamber would feel that maybe it's best for us to just relax on this and not to move on it. And not antagonize the president. I mean, not moving on it would not necessarily antagonize the president.
And actually, if we look at the names, three are really the hardcore loyalists. Are we considered hardcore loyalists of the president? No, those are the three he endorsed: De La Rosa, Tolentino, and Bongo.
Yeah.
So it seems predictable that these three will push for whatever.
And
he
then if
wants.
you add people who belong to PDP Laban, then you would put in Manny Pacquiao and Senator Coco Pimentel. But of course, we know what happened to Senator Coco Pimentel in the Hugpong sample ballot also, where he was
yeah.
dropped from the sample
Yes,
ballot,
yeah,
right?
okay.
So, as I said, even in the past, the Senate has always been more independent, and the people in the Senate actually even cross party lines. We've had a minority and majority where the parties were split, where members of the Liberal Party were members of the majority and members of the minority. So you expect the same level of atomistic and independent action coming from all of these 24 senators.
Again, some people can't get over the fact that no opposition candidate, is winning, and it's difficult to compare it to 1938. So this is the first in post-Marcos midterm election history that there's zero opposition. So you're saying it's not healthy for our democracy.
Well, it's not really healthy, but it's not something that is surprising, because if you talk about opposition per se, it's pretty hard. I think voters, for example, don't necessarily favor political parties. Only less than 1 out of 10,
I see.
if you ask them in a survey, say that they favor political party. When you ask them what political party they give the name of the politician. So that means those political parties are
Abstract to them.
labels,
Oh, yeah.
are abstract, and they revolve around personalities that they identify with. That's why, as I said, it's when you talk about, let's say, one party not garnering that many seats, it's really a function of that long-term problem that the linkage between parties and citizens in this country is pretty weak. And parties by themselves are really quite weak. So that's the reason why our opposition, in the past, when someone wants to run in the opposition, what you do is you create your own party, right?
Yeah.
And claim to be the opposition. So, and in the past we had two slates. The only difference now is that we don't have two main slates that are contending for the positions.
But did you find the fact that Duterte did not endorse a full slate, unlike, remember, when Pinoy had Team Pinoy,
Yeah.
and FVR had Team Unity,
Yeah,
Gloria.
and Gloria had Team Unity.
Yeah, and then the People
they have the
Power
People Power
Coalition. So now he
Coalition.
did not have a united slate. He just endorsed three.
And that just goes to show that, it's not a question. Duterte doesn't feel that he needs that much support from Congress. He endorsed 11, 3 got in, then you had Dugpong with 13, and then you have Ocho Derecho with 8. You have PDP Laban with how many candidates? So you had several slates altogether. And the president basically wished all of the ones who are supporting him well. Of course, there were people who benefited from closer association with him, and those are the people who are making it now. Former SAP Bongo, former PNP Chief Bato de la Rosa, and former political advisor Francis Tolentino.
Also, another interesting thing during this election is that the president and his daughter Sarah endorsed rival candidates, or they even endorsed two candidates for House Speaker.
Yeah.
So that's a local practice in Davao, which has now surfaced and become a national thing.
Yeah.
This has contributed to the blurring of lines of political parties. No?
Yeah, and we've seen that even in the past, where political parties who are dominant and in a coalition at the central government level decide to just simply declare local races as open. By local races, I mean even races for district congressmen as open, because remember, Marites, in the past you had alliances between Lakas, Campi. They were two separate parties. Then eventually they merged, right? Under Pinoy, there was an alliance between LP, the National Unity Party, and NPC, right? UNA eventually was formed as an alliance between PMP and PDP Laban. So, but they didn't even label themselves as an opposition. because they were not really completely opposed to the government. And remember, in the last midterm elections, they had 3 guest candidates
Yes, correct.
to complete 12, and who were
Yeah.
eventually forced to make a choice whether they belong to Team Pinoy or Una. So that just goes to show how really porous that political party boundaries are.
And maybe for the final question, Ronnie, many people are saying that now the Senate is really the platform where candidates launch nurture their presidential ambitions. Like now, number one, Cynthia Villar, Grace Poe. But Duterte broke this mold straight from city mayor to president. Do you think that the Senate's still a viable platform for launching your presidential candidacy?
Well, not really, because if you think just post Marcos, Philippines, we've had 2 presidents who have broken that mold. You have FBR,
Oh, okay.
and then you have Duterte.
Duterte.
So, Noynoy was a senator, but senator for 3 years. But the difference there is that it's not because of him being in the Senate, but because of him being the son
Correct.
of
I see. Yeah.
famous parents, no? One of whom just died.
Died.
And he was pushed to run as president. So it was just a coincidence that he was in the Senate.
see.
If he were in the House, it may have not really mattered where he was, right? Because he was he was being pushed because he was supposed to continue the legacy of the mom. So the ones who made it to the top spot in the Senate in post-Marcos elections have not won.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, Lauren Legard the top twice, Marlo has top
yes.
also. Who else? Grace Poe topped the 2013 elections, ran as
And
president.
yes.
So, being number
Interesting.
1 in the Senate race, the only one I think who made it would be Noli De Castro, who topped the who topped a senatorial election,
And became vice president.
Yeah. So,
Interesting.
so if you look at the chances of someone who ranks number 1 and running for a higher position, it's not as good, at least in post-Marcos Philippines.
Okay, so any final thoughts? Maybe I failed to ask you, but I think that those who have been listening to this interview, I think they're taking heart that there are no real political parties, and as you were saying, politicians cross party lines. So opposition is now defined only because they run under Otso Direct, which is not also a political party.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, in the first place, when they branded themselves as Ocho Derecho, it was also to distinguish the group from the Liberal Party, although they had Liberal Party members, because they also brought in coalition partners, Gary Alejano from Magdalo, and then you have independent members also.
Yeah, the Philippines has too many political parties. I think we're an outlier in the world. Maybe we're the country with the most number of political parties.
I don't know, I have to check. But I think there are a number of countries with so many political parties, and political parties that eventually just die or just thrown to the garbage can and then resuscitated. In the words of a colleague in the discipline, it's just simply a label, and it can be easily resurrected, regurgitated, thrown, and replenished, relabeled. And that's what we have.
So we're still a democracy, Ronnie, after this?
On that note, I would say that I have more reservations in qualifying the Philippines as a democracy, not only now, but across our political history, because there are elements that should have made it more democratic that are basically absent beyond elections.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Ronald Holmes. Thank you to our listeners. We will continue this coverage of the 2019 midterm elections. So I think we've learned valuable lessons or insights from you, and I think we will. This is a Senate that will bear more watching, and we will see how the senators support or disagree with the president's policies, that like maybe charter change. Maybe we're not even sure.
The death penalty.
We're not sure what.
New tax laws.
Well, the new tax laws, we're quite sure that it will be part of the agenda, but we're not sure of federalism or if whether it will still be pushed.
Investigations of foreign loans. Those are the things that might come into the picture in the next few months.
Okay, so thank you, and we'll continue the coverage with Ralph Rivas.